All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this next week of the webinar. You will note that two of the regulars are noticeably absent. Adam is out and about doing stuff, and Gary is celebrating a marital milestone. I did give him a hard time because it seems like he's always celebrating stuff, and maybe kind of like some of our families do, which is take a birthday and make it a birthday month instead of a birthday day or birthday weekend. So, but I'm pleased to share with you that my longtime partner, Christy Trimmer, is here with us, and we're going to talk about I don't even know if it is a word that we used in the when we put this on social media, but as far as we're talking about trademarks and talking about how someone might impersonate and be an imposter, and deep fake. I think I used the word deep fakeism. That may be a jackism. I don't know. So, but welcome to, and so Christy, a lot of times if you just want to say hello, and because it switches between us, I think, and even though we can see each other, just so you know, kind of behind the scenes, that we can see each other, but I don't think everyone else can see each of us unless we're speaking. So if you just want to say hello and give a quick history of your background, fellow Tar Heel and all, because we do talk about a lot of Duke and Tar Heel stuff and other stuff on this show.
Okay, great to know. I'm Christy Trimmer. Thanks, Jack, for having me on today. I am an intellectual property partner at Shoemaker, Loop & Kendrick with Jack. I have been with Shoemaker for almost 8 years now. I practice all aspects of mostly trademark law, also copyright, and touch on some patent law as well, but mostly in the trademark arena, both on the dispute side, litigation, and then also trademark prosecution, helping clients to procure their trademark rights and police them and enforce them. I started out as a journalism and mass communication undergrad major at UNC Chapel Hill. Yes, fellow Tar Heel. Back when it was called the J School, the journalism school. I think it has undergone some name changes since then. I took a media law class while I was in the J School and realized I actually really liked law, which was very unique, I found, from my fellow journalism school students. And I worked as an intern at an independent music label. And so I kind of saw that contrast of, I don't want to date myself, but I was in law school kind of during the Napster generation. So it was the first time we had high-speed internet and could download music, but then also working for an independent record label could see the effects of that on smaller independent artists. And so I was really interested in this intersection between technology, creativity, and the law. So then I went to law school at the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, because they had an IP certificate program. So I could focus my studies specifically on IP law. And I was awarded the IP certificate upon graduation and an IP award for the highest ranking IP student in my law school graduating class. Practiced for a couple years with a couple different firms, and then started with Shoemaker in 2015.
Excellent, thank you. That's a very modest way of saying that she's a very smart person and she knows her stuff. And I used to do a lot more trademark stuff myself, but now having Christy there and just being able to walk down the hall to her office and say, okay, here's this problem, here's what I think, and go with it, and vice versa. It's been a pleasure when Christy has corporate transactional work and needs some help with that. So before we get into kind of the core of what we're going to talk about today, it would be appropriate to bring up a few things. There was a little bit of a discussion last night amongst a few people that are vying for the presidency. And for those of you who are not able to stay up for the full 2 hours or the interviews afterwards, I thought it'd be, I just quickly did a Google search and looked for kind of the first thing I found. And of course, CNN comes up, and the title of the article is "Takeaways from the First Republican presidential primary debate. So I'll just run through the, I think there's 7 of them. So candidates go after Ramaswamy. And yeah, it was pretty apparent that they were going after the kid on the stage, but he was being very bold last night in what he was saying and the accusations, and making it clear that he was not a politician. And others seized upon that to say, okay, you want to run the most powerful country in the world and you have no experience, domestic or foreign, really. So DeSantis doesn't stand out. Christie doesn't have a breakout moment. Candidates draw distinctions on abortion. DeSantis tries but fails to duck the January 6th question after being pressed by Pence. Haley leans towards the general election. Scott sticks to Mr. Nice Guy routine. So there is your, in a 20-second nutshell, what happened last night, according to CNN. Of course, a couple other things in the news, a small plane crash, I guess yesterday, of that general who tried to create or proceed with insurrection in Russia. Plane was shot down. I think they're speculating as to what's going on with that. Little thing going on in Georgia with former president turning himself in and posting a $200,000 bail. So a lot of interesting things going on. And what is funny is that we have some clients from Italy in town checking on their U.S. businesses. And so I just had the opportunity to ask them, what are your thoughts or perspective on what's going on in the U.S.? And the look on his face, he just kind of shook his head. It's like, okay. Now, granted, Italy has a lot of problems as well. But it's just, he was trying to express, I think he may have used the word Looney Tunes, I think, which is kind of funny when you think about it. But interesting to get other people's perspective. So what I want to do now, if I can get it appropriately on the screen, is to share with you, and I think I've done this in a prior webinar here not too long ago, but for those of you that missed it, I think it's appropriate to properly set the foundation and background of what we're going to be talking about, and then we can go further into it. So what I want to do is, let's see if this pops up. Okay. All right, so a quick few slides on trademarks, because really that's what we're talking about, which is protecting yourself, your brand. And just as a general statement, there is a misconception, I think, that a trademark is protecting that product or service. What is really happening behind the scenes, unless Christy tells me differently, is you're really protecting the source of those products and services, so that when you have a trademark on a product, that it is not that product is what is being protected necessarily. It is that your business, as being the owner who has produced that or provided that service in Charlotte, let's say, and it's not that company on the other side of the country that is doing maybe something similar. So that's a fundamental concept that may be hard to grasp in some instances, because it's like, okay, I have a product or a service that I want to trademark. And even if you try, when you have to put up or state what are called international classes, descriptions of goods and services. So it does focus on those things, but what's really happening is you're protecting the business itself. So trademarks, let's see if I can get this to run. Okay, so quick little game for those of you who remember this game or have watched it on syndication from on cable. So go back to 1998, 2 kids at Stanford University who are computer science grad students approach you for a loan and present free, and this is a true story, present what appears a sound business plan, confirmed by your own due diligence. The assets they propose to pledge as collateral are the new technology and intellectual property, including the trademark application associated with the new service for online advertising, internet searching. So anyone who can tell me in the chat in the next 5 seconds what company this is before I reveal it, I will give you a Starbucks card, compliments of Shoemaker. So, and I can't see the chat. No, Joe says it's Apple. It is not Apple. So I'll give you, all right, Derek got it. That company is Google. So, and I want to go through the quick timeline because these two guys met back in the mid 90s. They filed an intent to use trademark application, which we can talk about what that means. It's basically a reservation of rights before you're actually using it in commerce. But it puts everyone on notice that you have an intent to use use that trademark for a good or service. And then it wasn't until about 5 years later, after these guys met, that the different versions of Google are released. And then it took another 4 years before their registration is granted. So what you're looking at is essentially a long gestation period, but pointing out that it was in 98 where they filed their intent to use, but it wasn't until 6 years later that they actually got the registration. And there's various reasons for that. So let's talk about what is a trademark. So protects words, names, symbols, sounds, colors that distinguish goods and services from those manufactured or sold by others, and to indicate the source of goods. The last part is a key component, as I said a few minutes ago. All right, trademarks can be renewed forever as long as they are being used in commerce. So we're talking about renewal, not potentially loss or cancellation. And then there's 4 types essentially of trademarks or marks. Generic are those things that are descriptive or that basically it's the word for whatever it is. And the federal government is not going to give you a monopoly over that word for your product or service. So, and then some words can become generic, like Kleenex instead of facial tissue, Xerox instead of copy machines. And this is the weakest category of marks, and in most cases cannot be protected unless it becomes in a different class called a famous mark, where so like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Burger King, those kind of things. Descriptive is the next category. So there is a link between the what the function or the nature of product or service, and it can become eligible if you get what is kind of secondary meaning. The kind of sports analogy that I use to describe this is, imagine that you have someone that you are trying out for the high school soccer team, and it's general tryouts, and then some people get selected for varsity and some people get selected for junior varsity. Well, a lot of kids on varsity already are known, have been playing, and so they've acquired this secondary meaning essentially with their skill sets, and so they're going to be on the varsity team. There are others who haven't risen to the occasion yet, and so they're put on the JV team. So the way I would describe secondary meaning is kind of like the process of going from the JV team to the varsity team, where you become known for that good or service over the course of time. And then suggestive is one step away. And then so you have to use a little more of your imagination to kind of put the link together as to what the mark is in relation to the product or service. And then arbitrary and fanciful is the strongest category because there's little or no relation to the product or service. You made it up essentially, and it's until you put this out in the market, people aren't really going to associate the two together. And just some examples of that, generic salt is salt, apple for apples, but Apple for computers is in the most protected category essentially. And then you see kind of the middle ground, Vision Center for eye care stores, although that may actually fall into generic. Suggestive. This is dating this slide a little bit. Blu-ray for CD data storage and Mustang for car. Although I would say that maybe Mustang at this point, it maybe is in the arbitrary and fanciful, because it's like it's a Ford Mustang, and is it a GT? Is it a 5.0? I know a lot more about cars now because my son is into that kind of stuff. So, but that's kind of a general background as to those different types of marks. And so what we want to go into now is basically a discussion about, why would you want to protect your trademark or need trademark protection, and some other misconceptions. So, Christy, if you want to kind of maybe lead us into that discussion about the why you want and actually need to be doing this.
Sure. So trademark protection can be done at either the state level or the federal level. Now, when you start using a trademark, you automatically have rights in that mark just from your use. So wherever you're using the mark and however you're using it, whatever the goods and services you're using it with. So if you have a local business in Charlotte and you're using your trademark here, then your rights would only extend as far as the Charlotte metropolitan area. So if you wanted to extend those rights and make them of record, perhaps you wanted to expand into Raleigh or somewhere else in the Carolinas, then you would probably want to get a state registration in North Carolina, maybe also in South Carolina, since Charlotte's so close to the border. It's probably a good idea to register in both states. Now, if you have a business that's online, maybe you have customers or clients that are nationwide, then you probably want to look at getting a federal registration. And so that's done through the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and you can file a federal trademark application. And the benefit of a federal trademark application is it gives you nationwide rights. So you have your rights extend nationwide, and there's also a database that people can look up and they can see that you have your mark registered nationally. And then beyond that, there's also international registration in various countries. There's an international registration. So depending on, the reach of your goods or services, you may want to consider international registration as well.
All right, and I want to bring up also a misconception, common misconception in that, and I brought this up before as well here, is that just because you have your name registered with the North Carolina Secretary of State, South Carolina, Vermont, New York, wherever, that you automatically get intellectual property rights to that name. So that and then you take basically your articles of incorporation that have been filed, you take a copy of that and you send it to the other side or to the potential infringers and say, you guys need to stop because, hey, look, we have this registration with the Secretary of State. And so that is not sufficient. You cannot, that isn't a sufficient weapon to use to stop someone from infringing. So, looking at why you would want to proceed forward in addition to registering it, but kind of using it as a offensive weapon and a defensive weapon as well to protect against, infringers, poachers, and those kind of things. So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that. And by the way, if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt. This is not, as you know, never meant to be a lecture. It's meant to be interactive and be responsive. So, but we're going to keep talking unless people have questions. So please proceed.
Yeah, so as Jack said that, your business registration, or if you have a DBA, those are not trademarks. You don't have rights in your name unless you're using it in commerce to consumers. And so you would want to register it separately, either with the state or states, or with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. That's how you get your trademark rights. So there is a lot of confusion on that. And there's certain evidence of use that you have to submit when you're filing for your trademark registration, and you have to show the Patent and Trademark Office that you are actually using your mark in commerce. And there's certain examples for goods. It typically has to be a product label or on the product itself. So you want the brand name or the product name on the product itself. And if it's with services, you can submit things like your website, brochures, or ways that you're advertising to consumers your trademark or service mark. The key component for any kind of trademark infringement is how it's being viewed by the consumer, because trademark law is really twofold. It's one, to protect both the trademark owner from others being able to knock off their brand or confuse consumers, but then also it protects the consumer, so that consumers aren't, buying one product because they think that it's from another company. And so it protects both the trademark owner and then also the consumer.
So there's also, in relation to that, so here the scenario would be that you put out a product or service, and here in Charlotte, and then a consumer, let's say it's a restaurant, goes and eats here, and then they go maybe to Raleigh or to Columbia or Charleston, and they go to a restaurant that they think is affiliated with yours, and then they have a really bad time, either bad experience, bad food, and then what that is going to cause them to likely do, the psychology of that is they're never going to come back to that restaurant in Charlotte, or they're going to be reluctant to do that. And even worse, probably post on social media that hey, this company, this restaurant, these restaurant owners are just, Charlotte's okay, but Charleston really horrible. And it's really hard these days to undo that once it's been posted into kind of social media. And so those are the things that you're trying to prevent as well. So the poachers, and the reason why we call this kind of corporate impersonation and the deep fake is because um, the fakers, the pretenders have gotten really good at stealing other people's stuff. When you have something good going on, or you have brand recognition, then people are going to want to either rip you off completely by using your intellectual property, or maybe tweaking it a little bit and saying, well, okay, theirs is orange, ours is green, so it should be okay. Or in the small number of cases, actually innocent infringements, like, well, we thought we could use that. We didn't know that was actually an asset of your business that was protected. So you have those kind of things. And then also, and before we get into the discussion about how you register a trademark with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, one of the reasons you would want to do that is to what I would call being dissuasive to others. So here's the scenario with that, which is one of you guys comes to me and says, hey, we have this really cool logo that we just developed. It has our brand in it. It has our company name in it, and we want to protect it. And we've never protected it before. And so this is kind of our first time of actually thinking about protecting our intellectual property, which is hopefully what is going through your mind at this point after, talking for about 20 minutes or so about this. And so you come to me and say, this is what I'd like to do. And then I sprint over to Christy's office and say, this is what the client wants to do. And then what happens is a clearance search is done. And we'll go into that, what that means. But it's possible that we have to come back to you and say, here are the problems with that, because someone already has that and you're not going to be able to do that. Let's say it was for an actual product. And this has happened where we have to go back to a client and say, you're better off changing the product name before you launch it. And hopefully you haven't gotten too far embedded into product labeling and, going to trade shows and saying, hey, this is, coming next, coming soon. Here's the new brand or on this, our new product kind of thing. And so, but the only way we would know that is when we do the search, we see that application or that registration listed, and then we have to go back to you and say, yeah, sorry, someone beat you to it. So keep that in mind as we talk about, the federal trademark application process. And so, Christy, if you want to go through that, and starting with, well, I don't even know if I have anything that is worth trademarking because, I got a name, I have some products, I don't know. So and this has also happened where when we get that question, we go on that person's website. It's like, oh, I mean, have you thought about this, and this? And I'm like, well, we didn't know we could protect that. So it's not a matter of, I would say it's a matter of just not knowing. But so what are kind of like the good things and that should be looked at for trademarking?
Yeah, and just to take one step back before I do is, you were talking about going to a restaurant in Charleston and maybe having a similar restaurant in Charlotte. I think that just highlights the importance of federal trademark registration today with the internet and with people more moving around more and going to different areas. A lot of times those local rights just aren't enough to protect you. And so it is really important to seek federal registration because, for example, with the internet is not segregated by geography. And so someone may Google your trademark looking for your company and somebody else may pop up. Now they may be on the other side of the country, but it could still cause confusion for both your customers, vendors, any number of ways. So just going to the federal trademark registration process. So as Jack said, starting out, you kind of want to do what I would call a trademark audit, or really an intellectual property audit. And that sounds a lot more formal than it really is. But you want to look at first your house mark, the name of your business. That is the most important and obviously your top priority for wanting to get protected. You don't want consumers or clients to be confused about who you are. And then second, if you are a manufacturer, have products, then you want to make sure that your product names are trademarked as well, to get protection at the product level. And then also maybe even consider if you have a really catchy logo, or slogan. Those are other aspects that you may want to consider trademarking, or even at least want to run a search to make sure that somebody else doesn't already own the trademark rights to that. So it's kind of an offensive and a defensive strategy at the same time. And then finally, the last thing I would suggest looking at is what we call trade dress. So trade dress would be all of the other types of marks or source designations that are not necessarily words or images. So they may be a color of a product. It may even be a smell. It can even be a sound, like the NBC sound. That is a registered trademark, or trade dress. And so we refer to these generally as trademarks, but trademarks tend to be for goods, service marks for services, and trade dress being those that I just talked about. So you would want to first identify what your protected assets are, and then you would want to prioritize them and decide, okay, within our budget, what are we wanting to seek protection for? What are the ones that are most important? And as I said, the house mark is generally the top priority. You definitely want to seek protection for your primary brand. And then we would do a clearance search. Now, one thing I will say about trademarks, Jack went through the spectrum of what we call the strengths of the trademark. So from the weakest, which are generic marks, and actually they're not even marks at all. You cannot get protection for generic terms. And in fact, if trademarks become generic, such as Thermos, Xerox, some of those have become generic and have lost their protection. You'll see brands that try very hard not to become generic. You see Band-Aid, making sure that they use Band-Aid, which is for bandages, Band-Aid brand bandages. And so they want to make sure that they maintain that protection. And Google is another one. Many people use it as a verb now. And so they make sure that they call it Google search engine, so that they don't become generic. But I see a lot of companies with descriptive marks. And so the weaker your trademark is, the more difficult it can be to not only protect it, but also to enforce it, because your scope of protection is much more limited. The trademark office doesn't want to prevent other people from being able to describe their goods and services simply because it's a trademark. But if you have been using it for a significant amount of time, or in such a manner as consumers have associated just your company with that mark, then that's where you get that acquired distinctiveness or secondary meaning, or join the varsity team, as Jack would say. And so as you move up the scale and you have the arbitrary fanciful marks, those are much easier to do. So we would do a clearance search, which would essentially entail looking at the registered marks as well as the pending applications with the Federal Trademark Office, That's what we would call a knockout search. Just make sure there's not any red flags. If there are things that we think that we can maybe potential risks, but that maybe your goods or services are slightly different, and we think that we could make good arguments as to why there would not be any likelihood of confusion. Again, confusion is really the keystone of trademark law. So that's kind of the process. You can do a more in-depth full clearance search where we search state registrations, state business names, common law resources such as websites, and if there's any possibility of risk. Now, I will say it's very rare that I do a clearance search that comes back 100% clear. So I wouldn't be surprised if you came to a trademark attorney and they did a clearance search and they say, well, these are the things that we found, and that's okay, because it could be these are just the risks. The way I see it, my job is to tell you these are the risks if you decide to continue with the trademark application. You may decide not to trademark. It may be in your advantage to not trademark, just so you don't put your name out there nationally, depending on how you're using your goods and services. But we give you that risk assessment, and then you as the business owner would decide, what risk you're willing to accept. We'll tell you how high or low that risk is. And then you can make an informed decision about how to proceed, and we can give you strategies for that. So that's kind of the first step, the clearance search. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, go ahead into like the filing process.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So if the trademark search comes back clear, we would file a trademark application, and that would include information about your mark. And then also it would be related to the goods and services that you're using it with. So if you, for example, you can have the same trademark in different categories of goods and services. Everyone knows Delta Airlines, but then also Delta Faucets. And nobody's confusing the two or thinking that they're the same company, or that the faucet brand is also running an airline. So trademark applications are done by what are called international classes, where essentially the trademark bodies have come together internationally, and they've divided up goods and services into, I believe it's 45 categories of goods and services. And so you'd put your mark in a particular category and then describe the goods and or services that you're offering under that mark. Now, as Jack mentioned, in the US, you can file what's called an intent to use application if you're not yet using your mark, but you want to go ahead and kind of plant your red flag and get priority based on an earlier filing date. So this can often be a good strategy if, for example, you have a new product that's coming out in a few months, and you want to go ahead and protect the mark. You know that it's clear, you've run the clearance search, you feel good about it, and so you can go ahead and file your trademark application, and that protects the name. Now, part of the problem we're running into these days is the Patent and Trademark Office is running about 9 or 10 months to review a new application. So it doesn't always fit within a good business timeline, but that's why it's important to run that clearance search and file your application as soon as possible, so that you can go ahead and start accruing those rights, even if you haven't started using it yet.
Okay, so I think we should talk. Okay, so assuming an application is filed, so then what often happens is that we have our clients, after a month, 2 months, 3 months, say, okay, hey, what's going on? Which is valid to ask, even though we've said, yeah, it's probably going to take 6 to 9 months or longer. But that's essentially what happens for, I think, a number of reasons. And I think a lot of this is Jack theory, but some of it is legit in that they just have a gestation period, and they have prior files on their docket, and they just have to get through them. And so, but you basically have put your stake in at a certain time, so that if someone 2 months later says, hey, I want to file, and their attorney does the clearance search, they're going to find your application in there and have to go back to their client and say, yeah, someone beat you by about 2 months. If they don't get it, then you might be able to get it, but it looks like they're going to get it. Or if they don't get it, they're probably going to deny yours for the same reason, for whatever reason. And that happens for a number of reasons. The second person doesn't do a clearance search and just launches it. Or, it's just that they think that it's not competitive or is going to be, and as you said, the standard is not necessarily actual confusion, it's likelihood of confusion. So, and then I would say that if hopefully we've done a good job with the clearance search and nothing is 100%, but hopefully you get back a letter that says, okay, you're mostly okay, but you need to make these adjustments. In my experience, the only one that I got through unscathed was for the Dalmatian logo for the Charlotte Fire Department. And I think they would just, okay, they're first responders. It's a cute little logo. We don't really have much to say about it. No one else is, and it was, they were trademarking not the Dalmatian because they wouldn't get that, but it was the entire package of the logo, and they didn't have really, and you cannot trademark the term fire department. So there was a little bit of pushback, but it was actually, we filed it. We disclaimed fire department when we did it. So they really had nothing to say about it at the time, but mostly you'll get back. And then there are some occasions where you as the client and we as your attorney want to reach out to this examiner and say, you are such a dumbass. There is no way that this is a problem. And you can't say it that way. You have to say, we understand your perspective, but we respectfully disagree. And let us tell you why we disagree. And so we go through that process. And a lot of times I just think that they, they wouldn't be doing their job, or the optics of not doing their job, if they didn't push back on certain things and tidy things up. So I think that they're just kind of, in some cases, justifying their existence. But in other cases, legitimately saying, okay, let's adjust this to make it more appealable, or make it more appealing to moving forward within the confines of federal trademark law. So let's say that you don't get a favorable opinion or response letter from the USPTO. So Christy, what are the options moving forward when that happens?
So that's called an office action, and there's a number of different reasons you might get an office action. As you said, they may ask you to disclaim a descriptive term. That's easy to respond to. You make the disclaimer just of the descriptive part. For example, yours was a logo and it had the term fire department in it, so you're asked to disclaim fire department. So you make that disclaimer, it shows up on the face of your trademark registration, and then it probably proceeds on to registration. Sometimes they may ask you to revise your description of your goods or services. Something might be unclear, or they might want to make it more specific. It could be too broad. So that's another one that generally is pretty workable in terms of making changes to your application based on the examiner's recommendations. When you run into problems is when the examiner finds that there's a likelihood of confusion with another registration, or possibly a pending application that was prior filed to your application. If it's a prior filed application, they will suspend your application and wait and see if that application registers or not. If it's a prior registration, then you may have to argue as to why your mark is not likely to confuse with the prior registration. And if you've done a good clearance search, you probably already know about that mark, and you probably already have your reasons, or your trademark attorney has their reasons for why it's not likely to confuse and why you proceeded with the trademark application. And sometimes it's not always apparent on the face of the registration. That's really all the trademark examiner has to go on is the trademark registration and what's defined in the goods and services. But sometimes you can bring in other evidence. For example, if it's a fairly weak trademark and there's a number of other third parties that use that same term in their trademarks, then it would be good evidence to show the trademark examiner, well, that's actually a really weak term. And ours is different because X, Y, and Z, and there's all these other third parties that are also using that term. And so in such a crowded field, consumers are going to look at even minor distinctions between the trademarks to make sure that, that they're not confused between the two companies. So that's generally a good way. Now, sometimes the trademark examiner doesn't agree with you, and they may not agree to register the mark. And in that case, you may have the opportunity, depending on how the other company is using their mark, you may be able to reach out to them and work out what's called a coexistence agreement. Maybe they only operate in California and you're in North Carolina, and you both can agree, okay, I'm going to stay in my geographic region. And for that reason, we're not going to have consumers that are confused. And so you can enter into what's called a coexistence agreement, where you both agree to stay within your respective areas and that you don't believe that any likelihood of confusion would occur. And then you could present that to the examiner and say, hey, we, the parties, the trademark owners, do not believe there's a likelihood of confusion for the reason that they operate in California, we operate in North Carolina, and we're not going to operate outside of our areas. And so therefore, we're okay with their mark registering. So that might be another reason. You can also, if you don't think that's a possibility, it's also possible to look at the registration and see if they're actually using the mark. It's possible that it may be an old trademark of a company that they're not using anymore, and you could seek to cancel the trademark to kind of get it out of the way. If they're not using it anymore, it is subject to cancellation.
And since you brought that up, I want to bring up something else with respect to continuing use of, once you have a trademark registration, that you could lose it because of exactly that, which is it might be subject to cancellation. And here's something that you may have subliminally noticed and thought, okay, that's kind of cool. So if you get on an American Airlines plane, sometimes when you're boarding it, there's all the prior logos of US Air, Allegheny, Piedmont on the actual airplane. And it's like, oh, that's really cool. That's nostalgic. Yeah, I remember when I used to fly on Piedmont. Well, that's great, but that's not why it's on there. It's because they're launching that plane from state to state and using it in interstate commerce. And so therefore they are still using it and it's not subject to cancellation. So my point is that you, even though, and we have like some of our manufacturing clients that will change the name of a product or no longer offer that product, but it's a really cool name that they don't want others to use. So you have to find a creative way to continue using that mark. Give you another example. Why do you think that Pepsi and Mountain Dew occasionally will show or put out there in the marketplace the vintage look of a can or a bottle? Pretty cool. But again, there is a business intellectual property purpose for that, which is they're putting it back out there in commerce for a short period of time so that they don't lose their rights. So those are the kind of things you have to think about once you get registrations, to not just say, well, we're not using it anymore, but we don't want others to use it, because there has to be some strategy implemented when you're doing that. And so wanted to mention that. And then also kind of the negative of going through a coexistence discussion is that now you've put someone else on notice of what you're doing, and they may say, thanks for letting us know, you guys need to stop. So there's always the risk of potentially doing that. So we're not suggesting that when that happens to automatically go and discuss that with the other user of that mark, but because there has to be a strategy that is thought about, implemented. Okay, sometimes it is you use a little bit of anonymity. We have a client that is in the trademark business, where he will work for big companies like Nike, Coca-Cola, and he will go in and negotiate deals like coexistence or buy out brands. And Coca-Cola does not want the other side. No, it's Coca-Cola. So you have to think about those kind of things, but letting the cat out of the bag. And then another option is to, if you're just at a point and you hit the wall where on the application process, is to just say, okay, well, we won't get federal trademark registration protection, but we're going to continue using it. The problem with that is that if, as you continue to use it, you're spending money in building up that brand, that trademark, that logo, and then you might get that cease and desist letter down the road, 2 years down the road, from that company that your attorney found in the clearance search that they did 2 years ago, or that the trademark examiner cited to say, this is why you can't have that registration, is because someone else already has it. And so now you're, 2-3 years down the road, and now you've grown beyond your market, your bubble, to a point where now you're infringing on that company that is located in Los Angeles, kind of thing. So you need to be careful about that. So I do want to touch on, Christy, the other kind of good practices that are kind of an adjunct to the trademarking process, like Amazon and SEO and that kind of thing. So if you can get into a couple of those topics, since we have a little bit more time.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we're seeing more and more in our practice is infringement on marketplaces such as Amazon, eBay, Alibaba. Those are all big avenues for counterfeit goods. This is particularly for our manufacturing clients that are either selling goods on Amazon or don't want others selling their goods on Amazon. And so this is where a federal trademark registration comes in extremely handy, because Amazon, for example, has their Amazon brand registry, where you can register your trademark registration with Amazon, and Amazon will then police somewhat for you your trademark if there are infringements of your trademark on Amazon. You can also file complaints through Amazon. So if you find that somebody else is using your trademark on an Amazon ad or goods, then you can file a complaint with Amazon. Now, I will say with Amazon and with Google, for example, there are AdWords or paid search terms. And so a lot of times competitors will do this. They will purchase their competitor's trademark as a Google AdWord or an Amazon search term. So then they come up as the sponsored link or the first item in the search. And this is not, it's important to understand that this is not considered trademark infringement under the current case law. The courts have found that purchasing AdWords is not trademark infringement. However, if they're using your trademark in the actual search or advertisement text, then that could be trademark infringement, depending on how they're using it. So if they come up as that sponsored link on Google and your trademark is appearing in the ad text that consumers actually see, then that could be trademark infringement. Now, where a lot of times marketing folks get a little sideways on this is that there is, you can purchase dynamic search terms. So you might purchase a trademark as a dynamic search term. And so even though you don't actually come up with the text that's in the advertisement, Google generates the ad text based on your search term that you purchased. And so then that can get you in trouble, because then you have someone else's trademark in your ad text, even though you didn't intend for that to happen. So that, again, is still trademark infringement. And so it's important for your marketing folks, or whether that's in-house or outside, that they're educated about trademark infringement. If you have any sort of agreements with companies that, for example, if you've gotten a cease and desist before where you were using someone else's trademark and you've made agreements not to use a particular term or phrase, you need to make sure that your marketing folks know that, so that they don't accidentally put something in your ad text and cause issues for you. So it's also important, that's kind of on a defensive side, it's also important to monitor your trademark. So for example, a lot of companies have separate SEO companies that are monitoring, who's buying their AdWords, who's buying their trademarks as AdWords. So then they can watch for if you have certain competitors that you think might be using your trademarks in an infringing manner, either in the ad text or searching on Google if you see, possibly counterfeit goods, but that you're monitoring. Now, you're not under an obligation to search under every single rock, but it is good to kind of know what's out there. And you have salespeople generally on the manufacturing level who know what's out there, and they have a certain obligation to know what's out there and what's competing with you. And so you should have a procedure for those people to bring those concerns to the right level of management so that those can be addressed. Because a lot of times in trademark infringement matters, that date matters when you first learned of the infringement. It could be a cutoff for your claim. If you had a sales employee that's known about a product for 5 years, but you didn't send a cease and desist letter, you waited 5 years to send a cease and desist letter, but the legal department didn't learn about it until a year ago, then that would be a problem. That could be a problem for you in litigation. So making sure that your employees are educated to know what to look for, and then also to have a procedure for kind of bringing that up the chain.
Yeah, that's a great comment, in that a lot of times it's not purposeful. It's just a lack of communication. And so you have marketing people that are launching stuff that are like, this is a great idea, or it comes to them while they're eating dinner one night, and it's like, okay, let's just go do it, and they don't tell anybody. And then it's afterwards like, okay, wait a minute, now we have a problem, because we got this letter. And so but there's also a cost associated with that, which is, do they need to run to every time they have an idea, kind of thing. Two questions that have come up. One is, and I'll do it in reverse order because I think the first one has a shorter answer, but the question was, what about advertising as comparable to XYZ, or comparable with Tylenol, whether it's like a generic brand or whatever it may be? So yes, that is permitted, but why is that permitted, Christy?
Well, it's funny. I actually have a case right now with a comparable with advertising, and there is a false advertising claim and also trademark infringement. So you are permitted to descriptively use someone else's trademark in what is called nominative fair use. And so when you are using their trademark to describe to your product, whether it be comparable with or compatible with, or maybe you sell an aftermarket replacement part that goes into another product, then nominative fair use allows you to use someone else's trademark. That said, you need to limit that use and use it in the smallest amount possible so that you're not running into issues of confusion. And what was the other part? There was another part that I was gonna say.
Oh, just about when someone uses it, why they're allowed, permitted to use it, and it's you were talking about the limited use of it, and so I think that's fine. Is that yes, you're permitted to do comparisons, and the only way you can compare it to something is to actually state. You can't say, well, that acetaminophen product that's put out by, I don't know who puts it out, Bayer or whoever. So yes, you're permitted to do that in comparisons, but there are limitations, as Christy said, which is when you go too far, or the comparison isn't factual, legitimate, or is exaggerated.
Right.
And there's differences as to say, well, this one's better than this, versus this one is better than that because it has this certain chemical in it at this, or more of this certain chemical in it. So sometimes the more factual you are, the more trouble you can get in, but you need to be more than, I think, generalized for the most part, in meaning to explain why that is. But I guess a curious question is, so I go buy something at CVS and it's, they say it's comparable to this. I don't really pay attention as to the reason why. I just assume that, okay, it's the same active ingredient that's in there. So is that sufficient? Do you know if that is so?
It should
level
be.
comparison.
Yeah, it should be. And I remember the other point I was going to make, which was that, for example, on Amazon, you see a lot of these compatibility products, and Amazon has guidelines on how you can use other people's trademarks in your description. And it requires you to put your brand name first and then have the compatible with or replacement for, and then their trademark, and maybe the model number of the product that it's a replacement for. This happens a lot with printer cartridges, water filters, those types of things. And then, in CVS, obviously you see that. I think consumers are conditioned to expect that. You see the CVS brand of, compatible with Tylenol brand. But you'll see it says Tylenol brand, it'll have the circle R. And so they're making sure that it's clear that they're comparing it to the Tylenol branded product. And then it'll have the generic acetaminophen, for example. So that's generally acceptable. And, I would want to have it looked at just to make sure you're using it correctly.
And that is a fantastic segue to the next question, which is why and how can you use R in a circle versus the TM? I know the answer to that question, but if you would elaborate on that.
I feel like as a trademark attorney, I think that's the question I get asked the most. So the circle R is if you have a federally registered trademark. And that does not mean you just filed your application. It means you have a certificate of registration from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And then you can use the circle R designation. You don't want to use it before that, and you want to make sure you're using it with the section that's actually trademarked. So if you have a whole logo and only certain words are registered, you want to make sure the circle R is with those words. Now the TM, you can use that anytime that you consider something a trademark. So anytime that you consider a word, a term, a phrase as source identifying that you consider proprietary to your company. And so you can add the TM. So that's something you can add if you don't have the registered trademark, or maybe you have an application filed, but it hasn't yet registered. You can add that TM, or even for service marks, you can use the SM. So that's when you'll see the SM designation.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up for any questions, anything that we haven't covered that is on people's minds. I will just say that, we've covered trademarks, which is, I would say, kind of one of the trifecta of intellectual property. Some people say, well, it's really quadruplets if you include trade secrets, but, trademarks, patents, and copyrights. We could do a whole hour talk on any of those other topics, but if you have any questions about other aspects of intellectual property, we're more than happy to help. For example, publications of manuals and copyrights, or whether something that you've been creating in your basement is worthy of patent protection or not. And so, but we have fortunately have all those capabilities in our Charlotte office and firm-wide. And so happy to help with those things. So I think we've answered the questions that have come up either specifically or over the course of our discussion. But, Christy, anything else that we haven't covered that you wanted to reiterate?
One thing I will just add, since you mentioned copyright, and it's kind of tangentially related to talking about our marketing folks and branding, is you want to be extremely careful about using copyrighted images. We see a lot of companies that get into trouble because they pull someone, in a graphic design firm or an outside marketing firm pulls an image from the internet and puts it on their website. And then they get sued by a photographer or an artist. And unfortunately, copyright law is strict liability. And so you can get hit with a lot of damages, even though you didn't have any intent of infringing anybody's copyright. That doesn't matter. All that matters is that they're copyrighted images on your website. And so it's really important to make sure that all of the images that you're using on your website, on your social media channels, have all been vetted, and you make sure that everything is licensed and you have the rights to use them.
Perfect. All right, so noon on the dot. A few reminders that this video will be posted on BGW YouTube page, as well as the Shoemaker YouTube page, and encourage you to share this with others who are also curious about protecting their intellectual property assets. I want to thank Christy. You rock. Thank you so much. When Adam and Gary said that, yeah, they're both out, I'm like, okay. And then so it's like, oh, Christy, please, please, please. And yeah, I didn't have to beg, and she was happy to do it. So thank you, appreciate it. And feel free to reach out to Christy directly if you have questions about anything, or reach out to me. You can, find our bios on our website. So again, have a great rest of the day. Have a great Friday Eve and weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.